The IV procedure began at 10:05 a.m. and was complete at 10:21 a.m. Mr. Djerf's veins were not optimal, which was expected, resulting in a few attempts prior to a successful IV placement. The drug protocol began at 10:24 a.m. and was completed at 10:28 a.m. Mr. Djerf was pronounced dead at 10:40 a.m. ADCRR Director Ryan Thornell has notified the Governor's Office that the sentence has been carried out and provided them with the time of death. In coordination with the Office of Inspector General and the medical examiner, has taken custody of the body and will be issuing a certificate of death. I personally observed the process of the events today, including the execution. I can say the process went according to ADCRR policy and procedure.
It started with the knock on the door. A quiet Arizona neighborhood, a family that never had enemies, and a man who had been waiting 30 years for revenge. When police finally stepped inside the Luna home that September afternoon in 1992, the silence was suffocating. The smell of something gone wrong hung in the air. The blinds were drawn, the phone off the hook. Nothing moved. And in that stillness, detectives would uncover one of the most disturbing crimes Phoenix had ever seen. A crime born not from money, not from impulse, but from vengeance. The man responsible was named Richard Djerf. At 55 years old, he would later die by lethal injection, executed by the same state that once gave him a second chance at freedom. But freedom wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was payback. His story would force an entire city, and maybe even a whole country, to ask how far anger can go when it's left to grow unchecked. Because this isn't just about a man who killed. It's about what happens when resentment turns into obsession. It's about a system that saw the warning signs and looked away. Phoenix, 1992. A time when neighborhoods still trusted each other, when people still left doors unlocked and waved at the mailman. The Luna family lived in one of those quiet corners of the city. They worked hard, kept to themselves, and built a life most people would envy. A stable home, 2 daughters, a sense of peace. But across town, a man they barely knew was plotting to take it all away. Richard Djerf had once been a regular guy. He held jobs, made friends, even smiled in photographs. But a single moment years earlier changed him forever. The day one of his coworkers accused him of a crime. That accusation sent him to prison. And while the rest of the world moved on, Djerf didn't. He sat in a cell replaying it over and over until it became his reality. He wasn't guilty, he told himself. He was a victim. And victims, in his mind, deserved revenge. When he was released, people thought he would start over. Instead, he began watching, following, remembering. Every name, every face, every connection. He knew that the man who had helped send him to prison had family, and that was enough. To him, the Luna family represented humiliation. They became the target of a rage that had been building for years. On the morning of September 14th, 1992, everything appeared normal. The Lunas had errands to run, maybe breakfast plans, maybe just another ordinary Monday. But that's the thing about evil. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock twice. It just arrives. By the time police got the call, it was too late. What they found inside that home would haunt them for decades. The details of what happened inside those walls remained too heavy to repeat in full, but the evidence was clear. 4 lives had been taken in what prosecutors would later describe as an act of cold, deliberate revenge. And the name that surfaced again and again was Richard Djerf. Detectives traced him quickly. The evidence was undeniable. When they finally sat him down for questioning, he didn't cry, he didn't beg, he didn't even seem confused. He said he had been wronged. He said they had destroyed his life. And now, he said they knew what that felt like. Imagine hearing that as an investigator, sitting across from someone so calm, so rational, while describing an act so unthinkable. That calmness became the most terrifying part of it all. It showed this wasn't an outburst, it was a mission. Who was Richard Djerf before all of this? That's what everyone wanted to know. He didn't come from an abusive home. He wasn't raised in chaos. He wasn't part of a gang. He was just normal. That's what made it worse. Because if someone like him could do something like this, what does that say about how easily ordinary people can cross that line? Psychologists who later reviewed the case said Djerf displayed signs of grievance fixation, the type of personality that clings to a perceived injustice and replays it until it becomes their identity. Over time, that resentment hardens into justification. The person stops seeing victims as people and starts seeing them as symbols. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Families, reporters, and the curious public came to see the man who had turned revenge into a mission. He sat quietly through most of it, showing no visible emotion. The prosecution laid out every piece of evidence: the planning, the timing, the execution. There was no question about guilt. The only question was punishment. The defense argued he had lost touch with reality, that he wasn't mentally stable. But the facts told another story. He had planned everything. He had written notes, purchased supplies, and even scheduled the timing down to the hour. That level of organization left no room for insanity, but only intent. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, there was no reaction from Djerf, no outburst, no apology, just silence. He was sentenced to death. For the families left behind, it was supposed to be justice. But justice never really balances the scale, does it? For them, the world had already stopped on that September day. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet morning became a reminder of who wasn't there. While the Luna family grieved, Richard Djerf was moved to death row. And there he sat for 32 years. Decades of appeals, decades of reflection, decades of silence. During that time, he gave a few interviews. Some said he'd found peace. Others said he still blamed everyone but himself. He wrote about religion, about fate, about being misunderstood. But one thing never changed. He never truly accepted what he had done. As the years passed, the world around him changed. The internet took over. New crimes filled the news. New names replaced his in the headlines. But for those who remembered the Lunas, it was impossible to forget. Time moves on, but grief doesn't follow the same clock. When Arizona announced that his execution date had been set, the story returned to the public eye. People who had lived through the case as teenagers were now parents themselves. And once again, Phoenix had to face the question it had avoided for decades. What do we really gain from revenge? On October 17, 2024, witnesses gathered at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. The air was heavy, the room silent, except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. At 10:40 a.m., Richard Djerf was pronounced dead by lethal injection. His final words were brief. Some said he apologized. Others said it sounded rehearsed. But for many, those words came 30 years too late. As the curtain fell and the witnesses were escorted out, one thought lingered. This story could have ended differently. If someone had noticed his obsession years earlier, if he had received help, if the system had been better at addressing anger and resentment, would the Lunas still be alive? That's the part that haunts people most, because Djerf's story isn't just about one man's crime. It's about what happens when pain goes untreated, when bitterness festers, and when society dismisses the warning signs of emotional collapse. Revenge doesn't appear overnight. It builds slowly. It feeds on neglect, loneliness, and the belief that no one understands your pain. And when that belief hardens into purpose, it becomes dangerous. The tragedy of the Luna family forced Phoenix, and maybe all of us, to look at revenge differently. It's easy to call Djerf a monster. It's harder to ask how he became one. How did a man with no history of violence become capable of something so deliberate? Maybe the real failure wasn't just his actions, it was the silence of everyone around him. The coworkers who saw his anger and ignored it. The friends who knew he couldn't let go of grudges. The system that never asked why. We often think of justice in terms of punishment, but true justice begins long before a crime ever happens. It begins with prevention, with compassion, with seeing pain before it turns into something irreversible. Even now, decades later, the Luna family story lives on in Phoenix, like a shadow that refuses to fade. Their old house is gone, the neighborhood changed, but the memory remains. It stands as a warning about what unchecked anger can do, and how easily it can hide behind an ordinary face. In the end, Richard Djerf's execution didn't close the story. It only reminded the world of how it began. A man hurt by his past, unwilling to forgive, determined to make others pay for his suffering. And four innocent people who paid that price. When the state pronounced him dead, the headlines called it justice. But for those who remember the victims, justice isn't a word that fits. There's no justice in the loss of an entire family. There's only the reminder that behind every crime like this, there are failures we refuse to talk about. Emotional, social, and moral. And that's why this story still matters. Because somewhere, right now, another person feels the same bitterness, the same rage, the same sense of injustice. And if no one listens, if no one intervenes, history will repeat itself. This isn't just the story of a murderer. It's the story of what happens when revenge replaces reason, when silence replaces empathy, and when society fails to ask the questions that could save